In this video, we're going to be examining the summing up of Judge James Goss from the Lucy Letby trial. Now, this involves an enormous amount of discussion looking at every single infant in the case. The document that I've got here is over 200 pages, so we're going to begin by looking at what he said at the very end of his summing up, which was related to general comments. So we're going to start here in chapter 20, Other Matters. I'm just going to go through this chapter and analyse what is said by Judge Goss. So we'll begin right at the top here. After the defendant was taking off nursing duties, she registered a grievance with the trust on the 7th of September 2016. She said she didn't know what to do. So immediately we can conclude here that the court never heard properly about the grievance procedure. It was mentioned a few times in the court case, including in this summing up, but we never heard, firstly, the jury never heard the full context. That's an absolute fact. And they also never heard as an absolute fact that all 7 points of the grievance procedure were upheld. Now, we've covered that in some depth on this channel previously, including in the timeline videos. But this was just information that was never presented in court, and therefore the jury missed out on critical context regarding not only those that were suspicious of Lucy and that essentially pushed very strongly for this case to be referred to the police, but also which gave evidence against her in court in the shape of Dr. Breary and Dr. J-Ram. So I'll continue with the analysis. She was precluded from contact with all but a few work colleagues, and the events were having a massive impact on all her life. It was emotionally difficult and she felt lonely. We now know this to be true. This is undeniably true. We know for a fact that she's cut off from her work colleagues. We know for a fact they were a support group. All of this has been well documented. We've been over this in other videos. This is undeniable. So we'll move on to the next paragraph, which is here. When asked about a note on an annual leave request form, page 48 of the images, which was found in a desk at Mostyn Lodge, this is a very rare reference to something that I'm not entirely sure what it is. I'm not sure what Mostyn Lodge is exactly or what relevance it has. I didn't look this up particularly. So I'm not sure what it's referring to, but it obviously is some sort of NHS building, so I'll confirm that in a second. So this annual leave request form was found in a desk where she'd been working up to her arrest. She couldn't remember when she wrote it. It was not all at the same time. It was what she did, she said. She writes down lots of things. So of course, again, we know for a fact, not only do nurses make a lot of notes, but they're encouraged to make notes. So this is nothing out of the ordinary. This is exactly how you would expect Lucy to behave. So we'll move on to the next paragraph. The names on that note were people who were important to her at the time. She was fighting for her career and wanted someone to help her. She couldn't cope with it. She only ever did her best. Then I'll move on to the next bit. Nothing much to say about that. Just going to read this bit up until here. I've already referred to you to the agreed facts of her arrest in July 2018, June 2019 and November 2020. Searches of both her home in Chester and the home of her parents in Hereford were carried out in the early hours of July the 28th, and then there were further searches on the 10th to 11th of June 2019, as detailed in section 6 of the agreed facts in your first jury bundle. So this fact was mentioned in the Operation Hummingbird documentary, where the police stated that they would arrest Lucy and then see if she wrote any more notes and then go back to search her house again. This could be deemed quite underhand, but this is something that we're already aware of from their so-called documentary. I merely describe as a promotional film. So we'll move on to the next section. We're actually going to read several sections here because there's nothing particularly important in this bit until we get down to here. So we're going to go all the way down to roughly here. The details of the interviews after her respective requests are set out in section 7 of the agreed facts. In section 8, you have the index of the images within the search presentation, the presentation itself being in the additional documents section of the post-indictment sequence of events, the last sequence of events on your iPads. I'm not going to take you to it. You can remind yourselves of any images that you wish to in your retiring room. There were various papers, all now collectively in exhibit reference bag NAC2. You have images of the writing on them to which reference has been made. In particular, the not good enough note and phrases, I killed them on purpose because I'm not good enough, I am a horrible, evil person. The defence invite you to find that these were writings of a hard-working, committed person, written for herself who wanted to excel at the job that she was clearly very good at and was distraught at what was happening, being wrongly targeted and blamed, they submit, for a system that failed and the faults of others for which she bore no responsibility. The prosecution agree that they are the writings of a troubled person, but they say they refer to certain babies and people and were being written by someone who was troubled by the terrible things that they had done and were being investigated, and that she was in part confessing to what she had done. So there are a few points that I want to make regarding what is stated here. The first thing is it's often asserted that the note is not important in this case by people who wish to obviously diminish the fact that it's now been torn to shreds and has no value whatsoever. So that's just not sustainable. It's mentioned in, as we've already seen, it's mentioned prominently in Nick Johnson's closing statement. It's mentioned prominently again here in the judge's summing up. So it's pretty obvious anyway that the note is an important aspect of the case. It was exhibited very strongly to media. The police have referenced it. Paul Hughes referenced it in his interview with Liz Hull that I analysed recently. The note is clearly an important artefact of this case, and the fact that it has no value whatsoever and it clearly isn't a confession note as was suggested is significant. So what I want to mention about the summing up of Judge Goss here is that for the prosecution he read out the key statements, the two very small statements that they extracted from the note. For the defence, Judge Goss didn't read out the many, many more statements that contradict the prosecution that are on the screen now. Not good enough. There are no words. I can't breathe. I can't focus. Kill myself right now. Overwhelming fear. No hope. I'll never have children. I haven't done anything wrong. Never have children or marry. Never know what it's like to have a family. Slander. Discrimination. Victimisation. All getting too much. Taking over my life. Everything. Hate myself so much. Despair. Panic. Fear. Lost. I feel very alone and scared. What does the future hold? How can I get through it? I don't deserve to live. I don't deserve mum and dad. They are better off without me. Now, he did mention that these statements are indicative of someone in a state of desperation, but he didn't mention any of these statements specifically, and he particularly didn't mention the ones that point to innocence. And then on top of that, there are other notes that are very, very much strongly supportive of innocence and trauma than they are of guilt, particularly the blue post-it note. Now, it's partly the defence's fault that they didn't, as far as I'm aware, as far as I can see, because no one's ever heard of it seemingly, mention the blue post-it note that has exculpatory statements. So I think it's important for me to acknowledge that there were mistakes made by the defence and the judge is there to sum up the evidence that was used in court. However, the green note, the defence did go over all of this. They didn't do a good job. I will say Myers did not do a good job on the note. He could have done a lot better, and I honestly think I could have done a better job on the note. With that being said, they did go over all these statements. It's just that Judge Goss decided not to include them when he was summing up. So we'll return to the summing up document. There is also a 2016 diary with entries in April on the 8th and 9th relating to LD, Long Day and Twins and Resus on the 23rd and 21st of June to LD and references to J and E, and on the 25th to M the images are Exhibit 12. So obviously I've covered the diary in a previous video. We know that it's complete rubbish. You can really see from just this very small amount of information that Judge Goss has presented here that the police should feel embarrassed about the suggestion that there was a code in it, but they actually made that suggestion after this summing up because they made that suggestion in their Operation Hummingbird promotional film. It's quite laughable that they could ever make that suggestion. Obviously, I've annihilated that completely. This should never have been in the court case. So we'll look at the next bit where we start to talk about my favourite aspect of the court case, which is the handover sheets, as we know. In an Ibiza bag underneath the bed in bedroom 2 were handover sheets for the period 23rd to 28th of June 2016, some with handwriting on the back, which appear to refer to resuscitations PMB4. In a Morrison's bag, there was documentation relating to twin 2 LNM, that's baby M, and 31 nursing handover sheets that related to a total of 17 babies, 13 of which were for babies who are named in the indictment. So we see again, as I've said numerous times, these are in bags, they're filed away, they're under her bed, they're clearly not of any significance to her. It's not something that has any relevance to the indictment whatsoever. As we're going to move on and see now, the 4 babies for whom there were no handover sheets were baby A, baby C and baby D, the subjects of count 1, 3 and 4, who all died in June 2015. So I assume that Judge Goss here has failed to read out one of the 4 infants, not that he can't count to 3, because he says 4 babies and then lists A, C and D. So I assume that he forgot to read out one of the 4, not that he's miscounted. It's hard to say, but seeing as he just said there's 13 out of 17 and I've heard this figure before, I assume that he forgot one of the infants here. So leaving aside that oversight, anyone can make a mistake, these things happen. It's important to note that these are absolutely key infants in the case. So many inferences were drawn from baby A and the twin baby B, baby C and baby D. So it's quite significant really that there were no handover sheets for these infants, because these were some of the most important infants in the case. Because once the prosecution had established its case, they just said, oh look, there were rashes again. Oh look, there was discoloration again. Oh, it's obviously an embolism. We've got the shift chart, so we know it has to be Lucy. Obviously, it's always Lucy, so we can just assume it's another embolism. So the fact that she didn't have any handover sheets for these infants, and also, of course, these infants died in quick succession. This was when, as we've seen in previous videos, Dr. Breary started to become suspicious of Lucy, whether that was legitimate or otherwise. It was in June 2015 and July 2015 at the time that these infants passed away. So they're very, very important in the case. And obviously, I've said numerous times, it's very clear that the handover sheets thing is complete rubbish. It has nothing to do with the indictment. It's completely irrelevant, and nurses take handover sheets home all the time. It's very obvious that Lucy's telling the truth, and she just left handover sheets in her pocket, and then she didn't want to take them back to the hospital because they're confidential, and she built up too many of them, and then she couldn't put them in confidential waste, so she just stored them in a carrier bag. She didn't want to throw them in the bin. She could have thrown them in the bin and got sacked for having confidential documents, or not, because there's quite possible no one ever would have known, because they just would have gone in a rubbish van, more than likely would have got trashed, torn to pieces. No one would have been the wiser. But she didn't want to do that because she knew it was somewhat sensitive, so she kept them in a bag under a bed. It's very obvious that's what occurred, and the fact I have to discuss the handover sheets so often is a major bugbear for me, because it's just total rubbish. But there's still some further discussion, so I'll have to go over that as well. So we see here the total number of handover sheets seized from both addresses were 257, of which 21 involved babies in the case, 4 in the Ibiza bag and 17 in the Morrison's bag. So that's a reasonable summation of what actually occurred. The problem is that this is evidence that is being given credence in a court case, which I found extraordinary, considering that it quite obviously, for anyone with any kind of critical thinking, just has absolutely no merit whatsoever. So we'll move on to the next paragraphs, which I've highlighted. The various documents seized in the searches were the subject of questions in the interviews termed as overarching interviews. The last section is in your second jury bundle, the interview bundle. The first and second interviews were on the 3rd and 4th of July 2018. They were after she had been arrested for the first time. In relation to the note, NAC 10, the sheet of paper filling both sides, which you'll remember having seen, she said she wrote these things in July 2016 because everything got on top of her after she'd been removed from the unit and she was going to have to redo her competencies and her practice might not be good enough. It made her feel guilty and really isolated, and she was blaming herself. She went to a GP and was given antidepressants. She wrote about killing herself because her practice hadn't been good enough, but she never made any mistakes. She thought the police would be involved and she would lose her job, which she loved. She was panicking. She felt she was being victimised by the consultants Ravi Jairam and Stephen Breary. She thought the nurses were a good nursing team. She wrote these things down as a way of getting it on paper, and it helped her process it a bit more. So we now know that essentially all of this is true. She certainly was strongly attacked, I would say is reasonable to say, by Stephen Breary and Dr. Ravi Jairam. We know exactly what happened at that unit now. I've been through this in timelines. We've got all this from the Thirlwall documents. It's not an unreasonable description to say that she was victimised. It's not clear how the defence did such a bad job of dealing with the anecdotal evidence, but again, we know now, as it's been rightly pointed out, that this is a small number. A small number of the handover sheets are relevant. So this number of 257 is always, which is a lot. I think it's fair to say that is quite a lot, but 236 of those are completely relevant. So there's only 21 sheets. That's not an enormous amount. And then there's loads of infants for which it doesn't apply. And then they're stored with all these other handover sheets in carrier bags they're not open or anything, they're tied up. So they're obviously being stored essentially as rubbish, but just rubbish that can't be thrown in the bin. And then the explanations given in court by Lucy were patently true, as is reflected in everything that she said. So we've been through police interviews and she's given very plausible explanations for everything. At this point, Judge Goss is returning to the note as well. And again, it's obvious that Lucy's explanation for this is entirely legitimate. We know that she went to a GP, as is stated here. She was given antidepressants. She was really, really struggling. She was suicidal, in fact. She wrote about killing herself because her practice, as she put it, hadn't been good enough. So she was obviously going through a very traumatic period in her life, as you would expect. And it's obvious that this note is reflective of someone going through a traumatic experience. There's now an expert in the defence who has testified to that, but other psychologists have done it previously. But frankly, it's obvious if you look at that note that it's not a confession note. It's complete rubbish. So I'll move on to the next paragraph. Despite what she had written, she had not killed them on purpose. She felt if her practice had not been right, then she had killed them, and that's why she wasn't good enough. She was very career-focused. She wrote, "The world is better off without me," because she had disappointed people. She wrote, "I am evil, I did this," because that was how it had made her feel at the time. All of this is true, but again, I will emphasise that Judge Goss isn't reading out any of the statements that point to this. He's just reading out the prosecution evidence, essentially, and then Lucy's response to that, rather than actually reading out the statements that the defence have cited in support of that statement. So we'll move on to the next paragraph now. That year had been difficult because they were seeing more babies with complex needs, chest drains, stomas, and quite a few extremely premature babies with congenital abnormalities, a lot of twins, and then triplets. So it's a good job that this was mentioned. It wasn't emphasised nearly enough in the court case, but it has been discussed to a certain extent. Of course, we now know this is all absolutely true. And I should emphasise that Lucy made several astute medical observations, both during the court case and in her police interviews, which are completely correct. Everything points, in fact, to her being an excellent nurse, and she's a genuine loss to the NHS. I'm sure by now that she'd be in a position of seniority. She was very ambitious, she was very dedicated, she was very conscientious in everything that she did. And I, in fact, know additional information about this that I can't quite reveal at this point in time, but it will be in my book, that further points to this, even in addition to what we know already. So it's a great shame that, not just for Lucy herself, which is obviously terrible for her, But it's genuinely a shame for the healthcare system that instead of addressing the problems on this unit, addressing the fact that they've been forced to deal with or somewhat by choice, deal with a level of acuity for which they're not qualified and not prepared, and then they failed for that reason because they were a unit that wasn't capable of dealing with it. And then this has all been pinned on Lucy due to, let's be generous and say, the paranoia of Dr. Breary in particular and Dr. Joram to a slightly lesser extent. This is an absolute tragedy, and we see actually in the sections where Lucy's being interviewed in court and cross-examined, this is referenced by Nick Johnson, who tries to hand-wave her concerns and her comments, but we now know for a fact that she was absolutely correct. So I've highlighted the next sentence and the next paragraph, but I just want to pause after reading the next sentence first. She thought staffing levels were quite poor at times, with an inadequate skill mix sometimes. So not only was Lucy correct about that, but this has even been admitted by the Thirlwell inquiry. This is known to be the case. It's just that Thirlwell rather absurdly suggested that Lucy used these diminished staffing levels and problems on the unit as a shield for her crimes, which is obviously a completely preposterous suggestion. So then Judge Goss goes on to say, she was doing a lot of additional shifts and overtime and didn't think a lot of support was being offered. She said she didn't have any paperwork or medical records relating to any of the allegations for which she had been arrested at home, but might have inadvertently taken some handover sheets home. Again, this is completely true. It's very obvious that Lucy inadvertently took these sheets home, not least because the vast majority of them are absolutely nothing to do with the case. So the idea that they're somehow relevant to the case is just immediately extinguished, I should say, by that alone. So we'll move on to the next paragraph. She was interviewed again 11 months later on, so the date's not given here because it's illegible, June 2019. She said handover sheets should ideally be placed in the confidential waste bin. The handover sheets that were found at her home had inadvertently been taken home in a pocket. She didn't keep them for any specific reason. They were kept in a folder in a spare room because she didn't know how to dispose of them. It is quite extraordinary how much I have to go over these handover sheets that are literally nothing to do with the case. They're nothing to do with the indictment, and yet we spend an enormous amount of time talking about them, despite the fact I must have had, in the region of 100 nurses now tell me I've taken handover sheets home by mistake. I've probably got handover sheets in my house. I have had handover sheets in my house in the past, and so on. This is just complete nonsense. It says everything about the extent to which nurses' voices were marginalised in this court case, that none of this is in the court case. And people will still, who knows whether there'll be any comments underneath this video, but I still am approached by people occasionally. It's died down recently, seeing as I've made several videos pointing out that the handover sheets are a completely worthless item of evidence. But I still will encounter people who think the handover sheets have some value. They're nothing to do with the case. Literally 236 of them are known to be nothing to do with the case. The 21 left over, and these were just quite obviously inadvertently taken home, as is stated here, and then they're stored in a carrier bag under a bed and never looked at, which is literally the next thing Lucy says in a second. There's a bit of a pause here where there's some technical problems, and then he goes on to here to say she hardly ever looked at them, and then we move on to Shreddergate. So it's not enough. It's not enough that we had to deal with the handover sheets. Now we've got to deal with the shredder as well. So I'll just highlight this bit and go on and read this out. She hadn't got a shredder. Now I'll just mention yet again, she could have shredded all of these items. She could have shredded the notes. She could have shredded the handover sheets. All this evidence can be gone from the case. All this evidence that people still fixate on, that people still bring up. Oh, she confessed. She confessed in a diary. She confessed in a note. She lied about having a shredder. She lied about her pyjamas. I suppose she couldn't realistically have shredded her pyjamas, but everything else could have gone out of the court case. This Judge Goss would have been spared going over this in painstaking detail, and we wouldn't be listening to this nonsense. But anyway, in her evidence, she did confirm that she had a shredder, which she had bought between the 5th of April 2016 and her first arrest in 2018. I'm not sure that that's actually true. She said she didn't know whether or not she had a shredder in her house, and Nick Johnson made a massive deal out of the fact that she did have a shredder. But as I've again pointed out countless times, if you put Johnson in the witness box and said to him, give a 100% accurate inventory of every item in your house, he would fail, as would every other human being in the world. So the fact that she didn't have a shredder and she forgot about the fact that she had a shredder, how this can possibly be advanced as some sort of legitimate evidence by the prosecution, it counts against their own argument. Because if she'd known that she had a shredder, as I say, she could have shredded all this evidence. So-called evidence. So the fact that, again, I'm having to go over this is just indicative of the nonsense that runs right through this court case like lettering through a stick of rock. So anyway, it continues. Which was shortly before she was first interviewed. She only shredded bank statements, she said. The handover sheets and notes were insignificant, and she had forgotten she had a shredder when she was interviewed. It was an insignificant item. This is all obviously completely true. As I've stated, I will state this yet again. I don't know if I've got a shredder in my house or not. I've had a look to see if I could find it. I couldn't find it. But that doesn't mean that I've got one, because I might not have a shredder for all I know, because I've got a feeling I might have put it in the false roof, but I really don't know, because I'll never use it. It's just that I haven't thrown it away, because you know how difficult it is made to throw large items away nowadays. So it could be in the house, it may not be in the house, but obviously that could not be seen as any evidence of malfeasance on my behalf. The fact that this was actually discussed by adults in a court case, and that contributed towards 15 life sentences, 14 life sentences at the time for Lucy Letby, and also those presiding over this were paid an enormous amount of money. It's extraordinary. But obviously they think this is a good way to influence the jury. Now, we don't know whether or not that's the case, because we can't speak to the jury, but perhaps they're correct, and perhaps they're just doing their job, you could argue. But I think the fact that these things were brought up and we see the panoply of crap that is in this court case, I think is very indicative of the fact that the adversarial system just doesn't work. At this point in time, after many decades and even centuries of barristers building up strategies to manipulate people, and the level of evidence and the complexity of scientific evidence, medical evidence, financial evidence that can go into court cases, just to give 3 examples, it's very clear that in my view anyway, that the adversarial system just cannot deal with this. And if you give prosecutors carte blanche to bring up any possible conceivable item of nonsense that they believe they can use to manipulate the jury, they will do it. Whereas in an inquisitorial system, I cannot see any of this happening. I can't see the handover sheets being brought up. Certainly the shredder's not going to be brought up. Certainly the notes are not going to be given such significance, because in an inquisitorial system, they will be melted down to nothing, basically. So if that's not enough, now we move on to the paper towel. Now, of course, I've made a standalone video about this incredible passage of cross-examination regarding a paper towel that will be described in this paragraph here. When asked about baby M's blood gas records, Exhibits 7 and 8 in the case, which was found in the Morrison's bag, she said it was one of many she took home. It was an error on her part that it wasn't shredded. She accumulated paper, which she accepted she moved around with her. The sheets had no meaning at all to her. They were just pieces of paper she had difficulty in throwing away. So this is the remarkable allegation that Lucy waited around near a confidential waste bin so that she could fish a paper towel out of it that had blood gas readings written on it, because this had some sort of value or meaning to her. The other possibility is that somehow it was passed to her for some reason. Probably a nurse said to her, could you just look after this for a second? Then she put it in her pocket. It's a very busy unit. There's stuff going on all the time, as we know. They ended up doing something else. She forgot it was there and she took it home. Or she waited until the coast was clear, took the lid off of the confidential waste bin, if indeed that's possible as they're often locked, fished around until she found it. Oh my god, there's my treasured paper towel. I'd better get that out. Obviously, no one with a brain, no one with any brain cells would take this seriously, but, I still hear this being mentioned. So let's go on to the next paragraph. In the 2019 interview, she referred to her support network of colleagues who identified earlier in the summing up last week. This is how long it goes on for. Dr. A, Nurse E, Nurse A, and Minna Lapalainen. So we now know that Lucy was close friends with Mina because she mentioned it in a farewell statement. Others mentioned they were friends and friendly with her as well. So we know that to be true. So I'll just read the next paragraph. She confirmed her status as a Band 5 nurse, her experience and having started on the unit in January 2012, and the courses she had completed, including being trained to give babies medication via a long line, Broviac line, and umbilical venous catheter, UVC, for the safe administration of boluses. None of this is really of any relevance to anything, not least because we know that the allegations that are made in court have no credibility whatsoever. So essentially this is now completely irrelevant. So we'll move on. She didn't recall any specific training about insulin. So if you look at what happened in the insulin cases, there would be no training required, for example, to know that you wouldn't inject insulin into a bag containing glucose if you wanted to murder the infant involved. There's no training required to understand that. It's just common knowledge. Anyway, it continues. She said she learned through experience. She had not had training about air embolisms. I mean, this is all basically irrelevant because there are no air embolism cases in court, and it's all just total crap that comes from the... I'm not sure how best to describe the mind of Dewi Evans at this point, and was not really aware of them and had heard of them more from an adult perspective. She could not think of special training in any dangers if things were done incorrectly, apart from being mindful not to leave a line open. Indeed, we know that Lucy cited this, and we know that she completed a datex to this effect, which we're going to discuss definitely in future videos when I do an interview with someone in due course, because he wants to cite something in particular in relation to this. So we'll move on to the next paragraph. I just want to read this section out first. In the final interview, she was asked about her personal diaries. She made reference to the collapses of... we're going back to the diaries again? In the final interview, she was asked about her personal diaries. She made reference to the collapses of babies in the diaries because it was a way of thinking things through in her own time, expressing thoughts on paper. She thought she started documenting names after concerns had been raised in February 2016 that there had been a rise in the mortality rate. I mean, to suggest that these were meaningful references in her diary is frankly embarrassing. The implication is that this is some sort of gloating over her killings or some sort of celebration. When you look at the diary, it's just preposterous. I've obviously dealt with this in a previous video. It frankly doesn't merit any further consideration or discussion. She was asked about the note in the diary KL4 in which she had written "kill me." She wrote that because sometimes she wished she was dead. She had lost everything, wasn't working on the unit, and hated working in the office. So again, this is not consistent with the suggestions made by the prosecution. The suggestions made by the prosecution and by the police are that she's somehow gleeful in this diary. So serial killers that relish their killing and wish to celebrate them do not feel suicidal. They don't feel bad about what they've done. Sometimes they can be conflicted, but there's no conflicting feelings here. It's very clear that Lucy is traumatised, and of course, as I mentioned numerous times, she never referenced any deaths. She never referenced any murders. Let alone did she say anything favourable about them, as is kind of being suggested here. But actually, there's absolutely no evidence to support that. The other thing we should just briefly mention is that Lucy said several times that she was suicidal. She told this to the police. She said this in court. We know that this is the case, and I think it's hardly surprising considering everything that she's been through. So we'll move on to the next section. We're just going to look at this paragraph here. In her evidence, she said that on 26th of June 2016, she liked all the doctors at the hospital. So if they were ganging up on her, I know some people believe they deliberately targeted her. Lucy has never given any indication that she disliked anyone. So if they did have something against her, and if Dr. Berry did have something against her, it was unbeknown to her, because she thought she had at least a decent professional working relationship with all doctors on the unit. She was worried that she was in trouble because she had made a mistake in relation to baby, I don't know, there's an exclamation mark here, it could be baby I, was very upset and worried, but didn't realise that there were serious concerns about her. So again, we know that all this is true now because of the Thirlwell documents. Unfortunately, the court didn't hear about that at the time. So I'll look at the next two paragraphs now. The contents of some of the emails were pointed out to her, and she accepted that she was having a meltdown. She referred to the note behind tile 107 in the post-indictment sequence of events, an SMS timed at 27th of June 2016 with no named recipient. The note reads, Death X2. She said there were things she needed to document for babies that she had been caring for when she next went back to work that she hadn't documented so far. So that seems an extremely plausible explanation, but there's a couple of other things to mention as well. Firstly, this kind of note is not consistent with a serial killer relishing crimes. And then secondly, if there's supposed to be a code in these things, then surely she would have referenced all of the deaths and she'd be writing all the deaths down as they happened, in part of her supposedly gleeful celebration of these deaths. But these are just two isolated deaths that she wrote down, which is just clearly a note in a diary that has no substantial information whatsoever. So I'll go on to the next section. In messages to Nurse E, she referred to the risk of her embolus and thankfully her submitting a Datix report. So I've mentioned this already. That report related to baby J.A. and was made on the 1st of July 2016. She wrote, upon administering IV medication via UVC, the port on one of the lumens was noted to not have a bung on the end and was therefore open. Registrar informed. Lumen not accessed, bung added and line labelled not to be used. Sorry, I did a bad job of highlighting that. So I'll do that again. So this is something, again, as I mentioned, I'll be discussing a future video, but essentially here, Lucy is noting danger on the unit and drawing it to the attention of other nurses. We heard Michelle talking, we're going to see this in the next paragraph again, about normal stuff, responsible behaviour on the unit being weaponised against Lucy, and this is just one of many of those examples. So we'll read out the next paragraph now because this is yet another example. Not doing a very good job of highlighting, just bear with me. I'll try again. There we go. She denied that she was covering for herself for any suggestion of accidental air embolus and said it was simply what she found and felt it needed to be documented. She also referred to tiles 234 and 239 and denied she was getting her defence in with her friends. So, under any normal circumstances, this would be viewed as responsible behaviour by a nurse who was trying to point out a potential problem on the unit. In the case of Lucy Letby, it then becomes some sinister action that she's using as part of her Machiavellian countenance to try and provide some sort of cover for her actions, just like she took advantage of the fact that the unit was overcrowded with too many complex babies and they were understaffed, underskilled and making a complete mess of everything. She just cunningly used that as a shield for her actions, and here she's cunningly using this as a shield for her actions. Or alternatively, the unit wasn't performing well because they couldn't cope with what they were dealing with, and here she was just raising concerns about things that occurred on the unit, as would be considered perfectly normal behaviour. So I've highlighted the next paragraph here so I can go over a few points about this paragraph. She was asked about the conspiracy by the 4 consultants who she believed had apportioned blame onto her to cover failings at the hospital, and confirmed that she was not relying on individual failings because that was above her pay grade. Rather, she was asserting that the nursing staff acuity wasn't quite right, and she didn't think that some of the babies had adequate care over a period of time, and there was nothing she wished to add. So if we go over the timeline, just have a look at this period again. Of course, I've been over this in 4 separate videos. We know the full timeline of exactly what occurred on that unit. We know a lot of the details, and I haven't even been able to present all the details because there are so many. But Lucy is essentially completely correct. There was, I don't know if I'd use the term conspiracy, but there was a concerted effort to have her removed from the unit, while other key issues that we see in red, and of course elsewhere in the timeline there's a lot more red than this, were ignored or brushed under the carpet or disregarded. So Lucy's actually incredibly astute in her comments here, and in fact both of her comments about the acuity, all three assertions, the acuity of the unit, problems on the unit, and the behaviour of the consultants towards her, all 3 of those assertions are provably correct. That's the first thing to say. The second thing is, it's absolutely ridiculous, stupid in fact, to expect Lucy to give an explanation for literally everything that occurred single-handedly. As I've explained previously, but let me reiterate that again, it would be impossible for a single neonatologist to do that. Possibly they could do it over a very long period of time if they were given all of the medical notes and they were given a very long period of time to do it. But Lucy never had the medical notes and she's not a neonatologist. But even a neonatologist without the medical notes clearly couldn't do it. But to ask her as a nurse who's been incarcerated for 2 years, who hasn't had any medical notes, to give an explanation for everything that occurred on the unit, when here are a handful of conditions from just 3 of the infants: antiphospholipid syndrome, gestational cholestasis, lupus, thrombosis, polycythemia, respiratory acidosis, intravascular coagulation, intrauterine growth restriction, bilateral dilation of the cerebral ventricles. And that's not all of the conditions that these 3 infants were suffering with. I just picked out a few. To expect Lucy to give all of these things in the witness box, when she's been incarcerated for 2 years, when she's a nurse and not a medic, without seeing the medical notes, is utterly ridiculous. And then on top of that, she actually did give very good explanation for what's happening on the unit, and a very good explanation for what's happened to her, which is absolutely correct. And then on top of that, you've got these 25 things here that were failures. So she actually cited quite a few of these. But to expect her to pull out all these 25 problems, if she'd have known all these 25 problems had existed, I'm sure she would have cited at the time. We know that she was extremely responsible. We know that she was conscientious. We know that she did Datex things. She probably would have mentioned all these things, but she obviously wouldn't have known, because it's completely impossible to expect that. So this paragraph's one of the most telling in the summing up, because it indicates that Lucy was extremely astute and that she was a knowledgeable nurse and that she was correct in everything that she said. So we'll return to the document. She was asked why on the 25th of June 2015, over 2 minutes from 10 to 10 in the evening, she searched for mother of babies A and B, then mother D and father D. She said the connection was that they were babies that had died or had been seriously unwell. She said that she searched for mother I, then father EF, and then mother H over 3 minutes from 1:16 on the 5th of October 2015 for the same reason, and they were on her mind. She didn't say that to the police when she was interviewed because she couldn't recall why she had looked at some of them. She denied that she was checking up on her victims. Baby I was still a patient at the hospital on the 25th of June, but they were on her mind. So this obviously doesn't have to be malicious. This can be very normal behaviour. Again, this is yet again something that's being weaponised against her. But the more obvious explanation would be that, as Lucy said, she was simply concerned about the parents. We know that she had good relationships not only with parents that were in the indictment, but other parents that have spoken to newspapers before the court case. The Guardian in particular said that Lucy was an exemplary nurse and helped them and pushed for them to have their infant taken off the unit and dealt with in Liverpool. And that's why the infant survived, according to the parents. So hardly the behaviour of a killer, you'd have to say. In terms of the police explanation, again, this is just more nonsense, essentially. But Lucy's being questioned, she's been taken out of her house and so on. It would be very difficult. She doesn't know what they're going to ask her, but it would be very difficult for her to remember literally everything that happened and give an explanation for everything. And sometimes things don't have an explanation. Things just come into your mind all of a sudden. You think about something that happened years ago that has no particular significance, and it just comes into your mind. In this case, this is something of significance. It's parents where Lucy's looked after children. She probably just thought about them and thought, oh, look them up and see if they're okay. And that's obviously why she searched for these parents on Facebook. As we know, and as we're going to hear in the remainder of the video, it was a very minimal number of searches compared to the overall number of searches that she made. And this is really of no significance yet again. We'll move on. In relation to her searches on Thursday, this is illegible, I should say, November 2015, for mothers of baby E and F, Mother G at 11:41 in the evening, Mother I at 11:44 in the evening. She denied having read Mother G's name from one of the 7 handover sheets with that name on it, and said they were all on her mind at the time. All the parents of the babies for whom she had searched were on her mind. She often thought of mother of babies E and F. So we know this is the parent that she was very close with, that she had a very good relationship with, who was very thankful to Lucy for her professionalism on the unit. So again, it's very, very sad that this has now been turned against her. I'll pose you this rhetorical question as well. If this was some murder that she was supposedly proud of, as is asserted with in relation to the diary, would she need to read the name of the infant that she supposedly murdered from a handover sheet? Obviously not. So that's just another nonsense suggestion in this nonsense court case. But we'll just look at the last paragraph in this section. She was asked why, in the note purported to be written to the OPR triplets, she wrote to all 3 of them. She said she couldn't recall why she wrote to all 3 when baby R was not dead. So I'm going to look now a bit from the Thirlwell inquiry that discusses this. So with regard to these allegations, this is another nonsense piece of evidence. This is certainly a deliberate misrepresentation. I think you could say that this is an outright lie. It's not as obvious a lie as when, in the closing statement, the prosecution claims that Lucy had been caught red-handed when it's agreed evidence that no one ever saw her do anything malicious or untoward towards any infant. That was a barefaced lie. This, you could say, is rather a misrepresentation. So you can see on the screen, this is the yellow note where she's alleged to have done this. And she never specifically references child R. She just talks about triplets and then makes a reference to some of them not being here anymore. So Nick Johnson seized on this and tried to ask her questions about it in court. The reason Lucy couldn't give a reason for what she'd done is that she couldn't remember what had been written in the letter, and there's a lot of material, and if she's been asked questions very quickly, it's not like Nick Johnson says, okay, I'm going to ask you a question, Lucy, but first of all, please familiarise yourself with these materials that you wrote several years ago, since when you've been arrested several times, incarcerated, and now you're in a massive trial. He just fires questions at her and tries to catch her out because, he's completely cynical, and all he's bothered about is getting paid, basically. So this was a completely misleading representation of what is read in this letter. Lucy never made any explicit reference to child R being dead. It's just untrue, essentially. Next thing I'll move on to saying is that in the Thirlwell inquiry, the following was said. After the deaths of the 2 triplets, the father of OP and R was so worried that something was going to happen to baby R that he requested that baby R be taken to Liverpool Women's Hospital. R, a well baby, was taken there. As Mr. Baker, King's Counsel, says on behalf of the parents of OP and R in his opening submissions, Mother OP and R and Father OP and R believed, justifiably, that this decision saved the life of child R. So let's move on to look at something that Lucy did. I'll just zoom into this document a little bit. So this is from The Guardian. Kate Walker from Chester, whose baby had been cared for by Letby, said she had been rather shocked when she saw that the nurse had been arrested. Walker's son was born prematurely at 27 weeks in February 2013. He spent a month in the neonatal unit at the Cancer Chester. The 36-year-old finance worker said, "We were in the neonatal unit for a month before we moved to Alder Hey, and it was actually Lucy who pushed for us to be transferred because he was still very ill and she didn't want him to be discharged. The whole time I was there, I can't fault them. They were busy, you couldn't have long conversations with them or anything, but I can't fault the treatment of myself or my son." Walker's son, who is now 5, was on a ventilator and needed round-the-clock care after his lungs collapsed and his heart rate dropped. So before we go any further, let's just reflect on that for a second. So this child was on a ventilator. Dr. Derry Evans would say everything was fine, and then the child just suddenly collapsed for no reason. That's the way that he would put it. These things happen on a neonatal unit, even in a functioning unit. As we know, this wasn't a functioning unit, but this is just yet another indication of that. "I can't say anything negative about her," Walker said. "She supported me and she pushed for him to be transferred and only discharged when he was better. She told me every step of the way what was happening. I couldn't be at the hospital 24/7 because I also had a 20-month-old daughter at home, but I never felt like I couldn't trust them." Walker said she was grateful to Letby, a University of Chester graduate, for getting her son transferred to Alder Hey Children's Hospital in Liverpool for further treatment. She said, "I was rather shocked when I saw her picture. My son could have had more complications if it wasn't for her pushing for him to be sent to Alder Hey, so I'm grateful for that. And he is now a thriving 5-year-old and he's got no lasting damage. He hasn't had any trouble since he came out." And I'll just finally say at the end here, they've got a really hard job. It was very busy in that department when we were there. They were like headless chickens. They were under immense pressure. They all were. And we see comments here from the Royal College of Paediatrics that we know about as well. So this period, they were under pressure here. There's a 26-week-old infant who collapses in February 2013. This is before they went into this very pressurised period where they had these calamitous outcomes. As we see, this 27-week infant collapses suddenly, and they pushed for this infant to be, Lucy pushed for it to be the infant to be transferred to a tertiary unit, which is what should have occurred, as we know, with many of the children on this ward in the indictment period. So in the Thirlwell inquiry, they're talking about an infant being transferred and how it's fortunate because Lucy Letby would have killed the infant if it had stayed on the unit, but in fact she had pushed for this to happen previously, for an infant to be transferred to a tertiary unit, and that parent, even when Lucy's facing allegations, remained thankful and wouldn't say anything negative about her at all. Indicative of what we know already, that Lucy was an excellent nurse. So this allegation it just passes by in a throwaway sentence, with the judge suggesting that Lucy has somehow written to an infant that is alive, as if the infant is dead. It's completely misleading. It was a misrepresentation by the prosecution. It shouldn't be in the court case. In my view, it's a lie. And then also we have this further testimony from Kate Walker, who lives in Chester, indicating that Lucy did the absolute best for her infant, ensuring that the infant was transferred out of the unit, as indeed occurred with child R. Of course, in the court case of Lucy Letby, the jury doesn't get to hear about this. They just get to hear about the twisted information which suggests that Lucy was somehow being malicious. So in summary, I'm going to go over some of the themes that we've established from this chapter. The first thing, that all of the prosecution case is conveyed in detail, whereas the defence case is not fully conveyed, which to me seems rather unfair. There is a panoply of nonsense evidence. This comes as no surprise to us because we've examined and analysed some of this evidence in previous videos, but this summing up reiterates that once more. We see a weaponising of normal and conscientious nursing conduct, which is used against Lucy, instead of it being explained to the court that this is all perfectly standard behaviour and that Lucy was in fact just doing the right thing on the unit. A coincidence theory is advanced in relation to certain points, although we're going to see this amplified to ridiculous levels in the next chapter of Summing Up that I will go through in the foreseeable future. It's clear that the shift chart and confession note were both significant items of evidence and were important in the prosecution case despite claims that they were not important in court. Most of what Lucy said in court has been proven to be correct by now. Anything that isn't 100% proven, though, is plausible and logical. We see numerous statements that Lucy made in this section, and we now know for a fact, categorically, beyond any doubt, are completely correct and completely proven. It's clear that Lucy was a very astute and knowledgeable nurse, not least because her presumptions about the unit and various mistakes made on the unit have also been proved to be categorically correct. In fact, I'd say Lucy had, a quite unusual level of insight into problems that were occurring on the unit, which perhaps some of the nurses shared, but we don't see that being voiced to the same extent by other nurses that worked on the unit. We also know that Lucy was correct in assertions that she made about the consultants ganging up on her, what was described I would say what a transparent smear tactics by the prosecution as being a conspiracy. They're trying to make it sound like it's a conspiracy theory. But all she was saying was that the consultants ganged up together and colluded against her. We now know that that is absolutely true because I've gone over the documents from the Thurl inquiry and we know the full timeline of everything that occurred on the unit. Lucy was absolutely correct in her assertions. Finally, I'm still waiting to see this amazing evidence that I don't know about because I wasn't in court. I think there was a Daily Mail journalist who was in court every day, but I can't recall if she mentioned it or not. Perhaps she could help us with this. When I return to the summing up of Judge Goss in a future video, we're going to look at chapter 21. I was going to include that in this video, but although that is a short chapter in which he just looks at a few medical assertions made by the prosecution, kind of general assertions, it will probably take another hour to go through that, so I don't want to make this video too long. But we'll continue with chapter 21 the next time we look at this document. I'd like to be able to look at the whole document. It is 182 pages, I think, of the actual summing up, and then there's 20 pages of analysis at the end. So there's quite a lot. Whether I'll be able to get through it all, just like whether I'll be able to get through everything we have in the court case, I don't know, but I'll just work through everything that I possibly can for as long as I can until Lucy is exonerated. Finally, I haven't mentioned this for a while, but if you've enjoyed this video and if you've watched previous videos as well and you're not subscribed to the channel, it would be very much appreciated if you could subscribe. I still get more subscribers, I still get more views, I should say, than subscribers for each video, and I still get the majority of watch hours come from people who are not subscribed. So if you could just click the subscribe button if you enjoyed this, it's always very helpful. It helps you keep up to date with the channel and gives you notifications about videos as they come up. As always as well, I just remind people if you could like the video and if you could comment, if you have any comments to make, then I always enjoy receiving those comments as well. I'll just mention lastly that I'm planning to do another live stream this week. I'll probably do that on Thursday evening. I will release my next video on Thursday as well, and then I'll do a live stream on Thursday evening, working on some other stuff as well. So hopefully that will see the light of day in due course. But in the meantime, thank you very much for the support. It's very much appreciated, and I'll look forward to reading your comments.